Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our next study circle in the series we started a few months ago, exploring different layers of Indian civilization, namely Sanskritic era, Persian era, and Bhakti movement. So, in the Bhakti movement, we realized that in itself is a huge thing because which not only because of its breadth and scope, also the significance it had, a significant impact it had on Indian civilization and Indian psyche, and now Indian politics too. So we explored it further, deeper and deeper. We first tried to know about Bhakti movement in South India and then in North India. Then we are trying to understand, in the context of Bhakti movement, the larger question of how societies change, in that we know that societies broadly, mm, we categorize into two large parts. One is system part, political economic system part. Another one is rest of the society, which is more social, cultural, civilizational, intellectual, all those things. Put together, we are calling it as rest of the society. But we see that how systems change, we know clearly how systems change. One system is replaced by another system. But we also see at the same time, uh, along the system changes, civilizations and cultures are not changed. The old civilizations and cultures are not replaced by new civilization and new cultures. So the world systems and world cultures and world civilizations remain and continue. So this is a big theoretical issue also for us to understand. So in the context of Bhakti movement, this question became urgent for us because the way Bhakti movement, what kind of ideology it released and what kind of attitudes and it released and how it impacted Indian social mind and how it uh, remained a very powerful force. Even during the national movement, even after independence, uh, how it started impacting the uh, shaping the politics and especially electoral politics. We are clearly aware of that. So, as summing up our discussion, series of discussion on Bhakti movement and its impact, Ravi is going to summarize as well as analyze, keeping Bhakti movement and its impact at the center, and also explore larger theoretical questions which have been looming for quite some time before Marxists. I request Ravi to make his presentation.
Thank you, Bhargav. Let me share the screen. So we have been discussing, as Bhargav said, Bhakti movement for quite a few meetings. And now today, we will do the last part, which is evaluating the consequences of Bhakti era or Bhakti movement on what I call the millennial scale. Last time we discussed the immediate social and political implications of the movement in its own time and the way it has impacted in India even after the movement, that era was over. So in contemporary India. Till last time, we focused more on either the history and the details of the movement itself, or its consequences as far as the contemporary politics and contemporary society is concerned. Today, we will discuss mostly at the civilizational scale. If we look at India as a civilization, 3,000 or 4,000 years old, then in that long wave history of this civilization, how does Bhakti fit in, and what kind of role did it play on that scale? Yeah, so let me begin by reminding you or refreshing your memory about the major where we left off last time. Last time and even before last time, one meeting before, we saw that if we summarize the sources of the Bhakti movement, we can see that there were four major components. First was Tantrism. Although the Tantrics had their devotional element in their theology and practice, but Bhakti movement basically arose in opposition to them. The second component was Vedantic Bhakti Marg, largely Vaishnavite, and it had a greater impact on the Saguna stream of Bhakti movement, especially in North. And then Sufism, which came later, in 12th, 13th century, that also had a that was a major source of Bhakti movement, and this one affected the Nirguna stream more. And of course, this was happening under a large scale linguistic cultural transformation all over India, in which the classical languages like Sanskrit or Prakrit or Pali, they were being replaced by local vernacular languages, and literature was being created in those languages, and in which Bhakti saints played a major role. So those were the sources. I might say one thing. Last time I had told Subhash that I will speak in English because Hindi translation kind of takes more time and I speak slowly, but still I have, and to some extent I have changed my mind. हिंदी वाले भी हमें रोक सकते हैं, हिंदी में भी हम बीच बीच में बोल सकते हैं. मेरे ऊपर प्रेशर रहता है ये रिकॉर्डिंग वगैरह का, डिस्कशन ज्यादा हो, आप हिंदी वाले भी बीच में रोक सकते हैं जहां जरूरत. When we summarized last time, we came to the conclusion that Bhakti era and the legacy of Bhakti era should not be evaluated, assessed on just on theological, textual, philosophical, or literary basis. This should be evaluated against actual history, against actually what it has done, what kind of impact it has left on the Indian society. Also, we saw that often scholars, intellectuals, or various social movements emphasize that religion and faith as a way of life is a better option, and problems arise when in modern era, this religion as a way of life has been replaced by a more formal or institutional basis of religion. But we expressed our doubts about such hope from religion as a way of life, as more archaic or what I might call tribal forms of religion, or individual spiritualist form also. Today, we will deal with this question in a larger context to some extent. But we had expressed our doubt about, this hope from religion as a way of life to contribute towards greater tolerance, spiritualism, syncretism, and so on. For example, Gandhi and the mainstream of the national movement, which adopted Bhakti as the harbinger, it hoped that Bhakti would act as harbinger of secularism, tolerance, and peaceful coexistence of different religious communities in a society that is ancient, in a society that is ancient and a republic that is modern. So why has this hope been belied? This expectation has not borne fruit, and we see that despite Gandhi and mainstream national movement adopting Bhakti as the main component of Indian cultural mind and hoping that it will lead to a tolerant and secular society has not materialized. And then we also had some theoretical questions like, religion is, or these social imaginaries, like nationalism is a political imaginary, religion is a social imaginary, which of these social imaginaries become more successful as imaginaries in the sense that they start playing real role in the social and political history. So our original motivation was, we want to understand why the concept or the idea of Hindu Rashtra has such traction in the Indian society, and why Bhakti, despite all its claims of tolerance and syncretism and spiritualism and so on, has not been able to soften the religious identities. Now today's, this slide is also from last time more or less, but this is what we are mostly going to do today. How to assess the legacy of Bhakti era on a millennial civilizational scale. So we will bring in the concept of axial revolutions, and we will see modernity as a continuation of axial revolution. All these terms will become clear. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because this is what we are going to do mostly today. And our conclusion last time was, or our guess last time was, that the Bhakti era appears as largely counter-axial. We argue that its legacy must be overcome in the long run. And this has implications for fixing and fine-tuning our ideological, political, and cultural attitudes in general towards cultural issues and specifically towards Bhakti. So let me start by saying why we are bringing up this concept axial revolution, which is not very well known, not very popular. It is discussed among scholars and among historians and anthropologists and so on, and also social theorists, philosophers and so on, but it's not a very common term. And what the problem we are facing is the following, that this is a very large question that we are asking. Questions about an ancient civilization, a very large civilization with a history of 3,000 years or more. And Bhakti movement itself was almost 1,000 years long, and its impact on the entire civilizational basis is a very large question, much beyond our capacity. But the reason we are taking it, that adopting these terminologies as some of these concepts that we have often mentioned and we will encounter in some greater detail today, is that we need help from scholars, from researchers, from thinkers to tackle these questions. We are making our own argument, but we cannot make our own argument just on our own. The questions are too large for us. So we are taking help from various kinds of historians and scholars, not necessarily most of them or many of them are not really Marxist or anything, but they are acknowledged scholars of their field. And in that context, we are taking some major concepts or terminologies. I will explain that, as I proceed. So that is the reason I introduced some of these terms. Axial revolution being a major one, which I will use today. Why and how do some cultural forms and practices survive over centuries and millennia? Religion being one, or some religious forms and institutions, being such examples. Also, how to make sense of the idea of civilizations. For example, what goes into making India and China, for example, as separate and well-defined civilizations. हम example दे रहे हैं इंडिया और चाइना का कि civilization से क्या अर्थ है और सिविलाइजेशन बनाने में क्या क्या चीजें लगती हैं। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इंडिया और चाइना के बारे में दो अलग अलग सिविलाइजेशन होने के बारे में कोई शुबा नहीं है, लेकिन क्यों इंडिया और चाइना वेल डिफाइंड सिविलाइजेशंस हैं, क्यों एक दूसरे से अलग हैं, क्यों अलग अलग पहचानी जा सकती हैं? So there are two aspects to that. One is the what I call excuse me, what I call the depth dimension. By depth dimension, I mean that things survive for thousands of years, or of course, hundreds of years, but also at times, some of them thousands of years. So that is the depth dimension. Our present today, present day India has a kind of depth in which elements from 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago also stay. So that past becomes present. Our present is very deep and includes very deep contributions from distant past. So that I call the depth dimension. And then there is this horizontal dimension. By horizontal dimension, I mean that how do civilizational identities and boundaries arise? We will not be able to deal with all these questions to our satisfaction. These are very large questions, but we should keep in mind, we should first learn how to ask questions, whose answers will illuminate, whatever we want to illuminate, in this case, what role culture plays in today's politics. That is where we started from. So the horizontal dimension is how civilizations are identified. How do they gather their identities, gain their identities and boundaries? And then we, of course, have to see how to incorporate the level of civilization as a background to the history of social, economic, and political levels. History social history, economic history, and political history. How do you incorporate the civilizational aspect as a background to history as it unfolds? So let me just quickly bring examples of millennial survivals, and there are numerous. Scholars spend their lifetime exploring that. But I just picked one interesting thing that I found in reading one of the things that I have been doing. This is a ritual, or this is a yajna called Agni Chayana. It is scholars say that it is 3,000 years old, or at least 2,500 years old. And in 1975, a scholar, Fritz Stahl, came to Kerala, one village in Kerala, and because he came to know that this elaborate yajna was going to be performed. It takes, in ancient times, it is claimed that this yajna used to take one whole year, 12 months to complete. Now in 1975, the Nambudiri Brahmins who were doing it in Kerala, they completed it in 12 days, 1 day for each month, And even these 12-day yajna or ritual had, they had to prepare for almost a year for that. So this now is available online. This film is, I haven't watched the film. It's a long film, probably. But I just, I'm quoting here from the introduction to this film. This film presents part of a much fuller record of Agni Chayana or Atiratra, a Vedic ritual of sacrifice. It was performed perhaps for the last time in April 1975. This is not right. It was performed, as we will see later, in 2006 also. It was performed perhaps for the last time in April 1975 by Nambudiri Brahmins in Panjal, a village in Kerala, southwest India. In relative isolation and through the centuries, this Nambudiri community has remained faithful to its Vedic heritage. The 12-day Agni Chayana ritual requires the participation of 17 Nambudiri priests, and the event is preceded by several months of preparation. A ritual of sacrifice dating back 3,000 years, probably the oldest surviving human ritual. Its endurance remains one of the miracles of history. The film also explains the origins of Vedic sacred literature, discusses how the oral tradition is perpetuated, shows construction of sacrificial altars and sheds, and introduces the principal participants in the ritual. Now, let us hear one of the major scholars that I take a lot of help from, Robert Bellah. He was a social theorist, sociologist, historian, and so on. It is from his book that I came to know about, this 1975 events. And he says that this ritual has survived for 2,500 to 3,000 years in oral transmission and is still being accurately performed. In bracket, he says that Fritz Stahl found that the ritual he recorded in that 1975 ritual he recorded differed only in minor details from textual descriptions that are very ancient. So the way they were described, this yajna or this ritual was described in 2,500 old texts. In 1975, the Nambudri priests, they performed more or less exactly, the way it was described in the text. And Robert Bellah says that this was performed most recently in 2006. So this is something of a marvel. It is again a tribute to the fact that in India, nothing is ever lost. What is remarkable about this survival, and is indeed without parallel in the world as far as I know, is that this ritual was created in a society that was just emerging from a paramount chiefdom into early state. Early state was being formed, and the society was emerging from the, a society of chiefs, small societies, small communities ruled by chiefs. So this ritual is a creation of a society that was just emerging from a paramount chiefdom into early state that is barely archaic in terms of my typology. We will later see how Bellah talks about tribal religions, and then archaic religions, and then axial religions. So in his typology, he says that this is one of the earliest. It's more like, coming from not only from archaic, which came later than the tribal kind, little later. In archaic, we will see mythology started playing a role. In the tribal times, bodily performance played a role. We will come to all that in a minute. So the creation of a not only pre-axial but pre-archaic society is still continuing and is still being practiced. That's the marvel he is expressing. You don't have to read this slide. This is just to show you that how things survive. These are examples of some Vedic Havan mantras, and they are used today, and many of them, hundreds of them, and most of them come from Vedas. And these ones, for example, they all come from Yajurveda, as you see, after the mantras, after the shlokas, the reference is given, and they all are from Yajurveda. So what survives? What are the orders and categories of survivals? What survives easily and longest, and what comparatively, what does not survive as well. So rituals and mantras have survived longest and without alteration or distortion on a very wide scale through common religious practices and performances. The second comes the narratives and stories, for example, from the epics and Puranas, have survived almost as long as the rituals and mantras, although these narratives have survived with variations, again on a mass scale, and in written as well as in oral forms. Then third comes philosophical and theoretical texts, for example, Upanishads or texts of Panini, Patanjali, and so on. They have survived in expert circles and in written form. And the later creations, such as from the Bhakti era, they survive in folk traditions and literary traditions, but there is no comparison. They cannot compete with the creations of the ancient and Sanskritic era, the way they have survived without much distortions, and they are part of the daily religious practices and performances. The contributions of the Bhakti era, either literature people worry about them, or there are some sects, and some followers of those sects, who keep those traditions alive. But the widespread survival of mantras and religious rituals and the old ancient epical stories and narratives, as well as in expert circles, the philosophical contributions from ancient India, they have survived much better than Bhakti. And this may sound to you that I am kind of, contradicting myself, in the sense that we have seen that Bhakti movement is the largest and most effective movement in weaving the Indian social cultural mind, and yet, and which remains true, somehow Bhakti has seeped into the cultural mind, and those ethos has seeped into the cultural mind, especially the Saguna Bhakti, and yet, these longer survivals from ancient times are quite remarkable. So let us keep that in mind, that things survive the way they do, what survives and how, Now I have to introduce to you the concept of axial revolutions. And for that, I start with the concept of civilizations, civilizations as one can say, continents of large cultural landscape. If large there is a cultural landscape of the planet, then on that planet, the continents, the cultural continents will be called roughly, I will call them civilizations. And the major archaic ones, again, archaic, I will define a little bit more later on, but archaic means pre-axial. And you already know, I have mentioned it several times, that axial era is roughly considered from 8th century BC to 3rd century BC, or 800 BC to 300 BC. So pre-axial is before that. So major pre-axial civilizations, again, I have put it on a slide. You don't have to go through each one of them. I am not going to detail it. I have just listed it. Mesopotamia from 3500 BC to 539 BC, and this included the Sumerians and Akkadians in the area, in the region which is today's Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey. Neo-Sumerian Empire, within that Mesopotamian conglomerate, then Middle Syrian Empire, and then in the end, Babylonia. Then in our own region, we had Indus Valley civilization from 3300 BC to 1300 BC, but its mature form lasted, from 2600 to 1900. That's the date line that is usually considered effectively as the period of Indus Valley civilization. Then, of course, the most famous one, ancient Egypt from 3000 BC to 1000 BC, Old Kingdom, what is known as Old Kingdom from 2600 to 2100, and what is known as New Kingdom from 1500 to 1000, And later on, when America was discovered, the so-called New World was discovered, then people found out that there were equally ancient civilizations in the Americas, in the pre-Columbian, before Columbus arrived in America, in the pre-Columbian America, Maya civilization, prior to 2000 BCE. Pre-classic period is 2000 BCE to 250, and what is known as classic period is from 250 AD to 1700. These ancient civilizations continued longest because they were not interfered with the old world, with the by the Europeans. Europeans arrived there later and destroyed things, otherwise that civilization has a longer continuations. There were other civilizations too, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the major civilizations, that happened in the pre-axial era. Which were the major axial civilizations, 800 to 300 BCE, even though exact dates of each one is disputed, but by and large, there is a rough agreement. So ancient Israel, the age of Hebrew prophets, as you go by Old Testaments and so on. Then ancient Greece, which was the age of philosophers, Thales, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle from 7th century BCE to 4th century, 3rd century BCE. Ancient China, which was the age of Confucius and Lao Tzu. This was 6th century BCE, 6th and 5th and 4th century BCE. Then ancient India is also called an axial civilization, the age of Upanishads, Buddha, Mahavira, the epics, the 6 philosophical systems, mostly roughly in the same period, 800 to 300 BCE or 700 to 200 BCE. And also the later periods of Roman Empire and the advent of Christianity and Islam that came much later, although this is later than the main axial era, but they are also considered part of the continuing axial transition. Now, how did this concept came? Karl Jaspers in 1949 wrote a paper and wrote a book. Earlier, he had written a paper and then he wrote a book. And the book came out in 1953 in English also. He came up with the concept of axial turn in the human civilization. And later on, others have worked on it, elaborated it. It has become an active field of research among historians, anthropologists, theorists, and so on. And Karl Jaspers, of course, he was not absolute, originator of the idea, even though he coined the term. But he had taken help from earlier scholars, especially the massive study of world religions by Max Weber. So I have just taken a long quote, and I wanted you to hear it from the horse's mouth. I can't do better than that. So just, excuse me for reading a long quote from Karl Jaspers, his book. The most extraordinary events are concentrated in this period, the period of axial revolution that I mentioned. Confucius and Lao Tzu were living in China. All the schools of Chinese philosophy came into being, including those of Mo Ti, Chuang Tse, Lie Tzu, and a host of others. India produced the Upanishads and Buddha, and like China, ran the whole gamut of philosophical possibilities down to skepticism, to materialism, sophism, and nihilism. In Iran, Zarathustra taught a challenging view of the world as a struggle between good and evil. In Palestine, the prophets made their appearance from Elijah by way of Isaiah, Jeremiah to Deutero-Isaiah. Greece witnessed the appearance of Homer, of the philosophers Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Plato, of the tragedians Thucydides and Archimedes. Everything implied by these names developed during these few centuries almost simultaneously in China, India, and the West, without any one of these regions knowing the others. What is new about this age in all 3 areas of the world is that man becomes conscious of being. Karl Jaspers was an existential philosopher, and he used this term being, in that philosophical sense. We will not go into those philosophical details, but, by being, you take existence of everything, is that man becomes conscious of being as a whole, of himself and his limitations. He experiences the terror of the world and his own powerlessness. He asks radical questions. Face to face with the void, he strives for liberation and redemption. By consciously recognizing his limits, he sets himself the highest goals. He experiences absoluteness in the depths of the selfhood and in the lucidity of transcendence. This concept of transcendence, I will elaborate a little bit more later. He continues with some gaps I have taken. The mythical age, with its tranquility and self-evidence, was at an end. The mythical age was ending. The Greeks, the Indian, and the Chinese philosophers were unmythical in their decisive insights, as were the prophets in their ideas of God. Rationality and rationally clarified experience launched a struggle against the myth, what in philosophical language will be called logos against mythos. A further struggle developed for the transcendence of the one God against non-existent demons. And finally, an ethical rebellion took place against the unreal figures of the gods, gods in plural. Religion was rendered ethical, and the majesty of deity thereby increased. I mean, all these things will become clearer, but he's bringing in all the important points. He's basically describing tribal religion as a way of life and as a way of performance and as a way of dependent on feeding the gods, so to speak, to religion as a spirituality, as concept, many gods and demons being replaced by one God, monotheism, and ethics flowing out of religion rather than community practice, determining ethics, So really, for the first time, religion prescribed ethics on a universal basis, This is the meaning we will see of role of transcendence later. Okay, so I continue with the quote. This overall modification of humanity may be termed spiritualization. For the first time, philosophers appeared. Human beings dared to rely on themselves as individuals. Hermits and wandering thinkers in China, ascetics in India, philosophers in Greece, and prophets in Israel all belong together. However much they may differ from each other in their beliefs, the content of their thought and their inner dispositions. These may be different, but in some way he is putting them all together. Man proved capable of contrasting himself inwardly with the entire universe. Man posted himself, in front of the entire universe. He discovered within himself the origin from which to raise himself above his own self and the world. So this was a quote, I think it's a remarkable quote, even though it's a whole book that he has written on these things, but this few lines taken from 3-4 paragraphs, they are, I found them quite illuminating about the concept of the axial turn.
Sorry, can we get distilled Hindi for this? Such a beautiful paragraph, because we can't read again and again now.
Okay.
So can you distill in Hindi for us?
Yeah, just sure. Let me go back. You mean I should distill this Karl Jasper's paragraph? Yeah. Okay. कार्ल जास्पर्स कहते हैं, हम एग्जैक्ट ट्रांसलेशन तो इतनी जल्दी नहीं कर पाएंगे, लेकिन वो कहते हैं कि ये बहुत ही अद्भुत इवेंट्स थी इस पीरियड में. ये वो पीरियड था जब चीन में कन्फ्यूशियस और लाओत्से मौजूद थे, और उनके साथ चाइनीज फिलॉसफी के वेरियस ब्रांचेस, स्कूल्स मौजूद थी. उसमें ये नाम लेते हैं मोती, चुआंगसे, लियात्सु और बहुत सारे अदर्स का. इंडिया में वही पीरियड इन पैरेलल, विदाउट नोइंग ईच अदर, एक दूसरे को जानते नहीं थे, लेकिन पैरेलल में इंडिया ने उसी समय उपनिषद प्रोड्यूस किया, बुद्धा हुए, और चाइना की ही तरह अनेक दर्शन व्यवस्थाओं का, अनेक दार्शनिक स्कूल्स शुरू हुए. स्केप्टिसिज्म यानी संशयवाद से लेके मटेरियलिज्म, क्या कहेंगे, भौतिकवाद, सोफिज्म माने बहसवाद, हम ऐसे ट्रांसलेट करें तो निहिलिज्म, शून्यवाद, ये सारे तरह तरह के फिलोसॉफिकल स्कूल्स जिनको हम दुनिया के पैमाने पे जानते हैं, इंडिया में उस पीरियड में ईसा से 500-700 साल पहले या 300 साल पहले ये पैदा हुई. ईरान में ज़रथुस्त्र ने पहली बार एक ऐसा व्यू रखा जिसमें उन्होंने सारे दर्शन को और सारे रिलीजन को एक ही चीज बताया कि सारा जो ह्यूमन एग्जिस्टेंस है, मानवीय अस्तित्व है, वो अच्छे और बुरे के बीच की लड़ाई है। और पैलेस्टीन में सारे प्रॉफिट्स हुए, जो जुडाइज्म के प्रॉफिट्स थे, वो सारे पैलेस्टीन में पैदा हुए उसी पीरियड में, एसाया, जेरेमिया एंड ऑल दैट। ग्रीस उसी पीरियड में होमर होमर जो हमारे यहाँ के वाल्मीकि की तरह थे, जिनके महाकाव्यों पर पाश्चात्य सभ्यता आधारित है, होमर वो पैदा हुए। एक व्यक्ति नहीं थे होमर, लेकिन अभी हम उन डिटेल्स में नहीं जा रहे हैं। जिन लोगों ने होमर के महाकाव्य लिखे, वो दार्शनिक पैदा हुए, पार्मेनिडीज, हेराक्लिटस, ये सोक्रेटिस से पहले वाले, और फिर सोक्रेटिस जो प्लेटो के रास्ते दुनिया की नजर में आए, ट्रेजेडी लिखने वाले, थुसिडाइडस और आर्किमिडीज एंडिंग इन मे बी सेकेंड और थर्ड सेंचुरी बीसी, सेकेंड सेंचुरी बीसी, द ग्रेट साइंटिस्ट एंड मैथमेटिशियन। ये सारा कुछ जो विकसित हुआ इन 5 सेंचुरीज के दौरान, एक ही साथ चाइना, इंडिया और वेस्ट में, ये सारा कुछ ताज्जुब की बात है कि विकसित हुआ, जबकि ये एक दूसरे को जानते नहीं थे। मतलब क्या था ये विकसित होने का? मतलब ये था, और हम एकदम ट्रांसलेट नहीं कर रहे हैं, थोड़ा एक्सप्लेन कर रहे हैं उस पैराग्राफ को। मतलब ये था कि पहली बार जब ये प्रॉफिट्स और फिलोसफर्स और थिंकर्स और पैदा होते हैं, तो पहली बार ये मानव अस्तित्व के बारे में, धर्म के बारे में, और पूरे कॉस्मोस, पूरे ब्रह्मांड के अस्तित्व और व्यवस्था के बारे में एब्स्ट्रैक्ट थिंकिंग और कॉन्सेप्ट्स लेके आते हैं। उसके पहले की सोसाइटी जो है, इस एक्सियल एरा के पहले की सोसाइटी, या तो ट्राइबल नेटिविस्ट है, जो ऐसे जो अपने जीवन पद्धति, उसकी जीवन पद्धति और धर्म को अलग अलग कर पाना असंभव था। जो कुछ वो कर रहे थे वही धर्म था, और अलग से कोई एब्स्ट्रैक्ट दर्शन या विचार नहीं था। कम्युनिटी का प्रैक्टिस ही सब कुछ था। वैसी ट्राइबल सोसाइटी या आर्केइक सोसाइटी माने वो माइथोलॉजिकल पीरियड जिसमें एपिकल, महाकाव्यात्मक गाथाएं पैदा हो रही थी, जैसे हमारे यहाँ राम और कृष्ण का वगैरह। उस ट्राइबल या मिथिकल पीरियड के बाद का ये पीरियड है जिसमें ये लोग एब्स्ट्रैक्ट थिंकिंग और एनालिसिस और पूरी दुनिया के बारे में दार्शनिक चिंतन की शुरुआत करते हैं। और इसमें फिर कॉन्सेप्ट आता है कि मानव अस्तित्व का अर्थ क्या है, और जीवन किस लिए है, जीवन का अर्थ क्या है, और लिबरेशन या साल्वेशन, जीवन अपने जीवन के चक्रों से कैसे मानव मुक्त होगा और उसे कैसे मुक्ति मिलेगी। ये सारे प्रश्न एक्सियल एज से पहले नहीं पूछे जाते थे। ये सारा दर्शन इन सारी अलग अलग सभ्यताओं में एक साथ पैदा होता है इसी पीरियड में। ये वाली ताज्जुब की बात है। वही बात यहाँ आगे कह रहे हैं दूसरे स्लाइड में कि मिथिकल एज खत्म हो रहा था, और जो ग्रीक, इंडियन और चाइनीज फिलोसफर्स थे, वो अपने सोच में अनमिथिकल थे। अनमिथिकल माने वो कहानी नहीं कह रहे थे, वो चिंतन कर रहे थे, वो विश्लेषण कर रहे थे, वो सिर्फ कहानी नहीं कह रहे थे कि ये अवतार हुआ और वो अवतार हुआ। उसी तरह से इस पीरियड के जो प्रॉफिट्स थे, उन्होंने जो ट्राइबल और आर्केइक जो प्रैक्टिसेस थी, सैकड़ों हजारों देवताओं और ईश्वरों की पूजा करने वाली, और सैकड़ों हजारों प्रकार के दैत्यों, भूत प्रेत से प्रताड़ित होने वाली, ये सारी जो कहानियां और जो मिथ्स थे और जो जीवन पद्धति थी, उस सब से बिल्कुल अलग एक पद्धति शुरू हो रही थी जो इन सैकड़ों खुदाओं के खिलाफ थी, और एक खुदा प्रस्तावित कर रही थी, जैसा कि प्रॉफिट्स ने किया और जैसा कि फिलोसफर्स ने किया, ग्रीक, इंडियन और चाइनीज, कि वो फिलोसॉफिकल सिस्टम्स का उन्होंने निर्माण किया और फिलोसॉफिकल आर्गुमेंट्स रखे कि जीवन कहाँ से आता है और जीवन का अर्थ क्या है, और मुक्ति कैसे मिलेगी। तो ये सारा जो है मिल करके इसने धर्म को आध्यात्मिक स्वरूप दिया। ये इंपॉर्टेंट सेंटेंस है कि धर्म आध्यात्मिक स्वरूप पहली बार ग्रहण करता है एक्सियल एज में आकर। जिस पीरियड की हम चर्चा कर रहे हैं। और ये पहले ही हम कह चुके हैं कि इसी पीरियड में फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम दार्शनिक पैदा होते हैं, और दे अलग 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 जगहों पर एक दूसरे से बिल्कुल अनकनेक्टेड, एक दूसरे के बारे में नहीं जानते थे, पैदा होते हैं और दार्शनिक सिद्धांतों का निर्माण करते हैं। तो क्या है, व्हाट आर द, नाउ वी प्रोसीड, व्हाट आर द की फीचर्स ऑफ द एक्सियल ब्रेक थ्रू? The first and foremost is the idea of transcendental, a world beyond, a world other than this world and beyond this world. This world is mundane. So the concept of transcendental and concept of mundane. Mundane means this world, in which we live. And they posited, these philosophers or these prophets, they imagined a world which is other than this world. It is otherworldly, that is transcendental, beyond this world. And the proposal was to reorder the mundane in accordance with the transcendental. If there is an universal transcendental world separate from mundane, and if you want to reorganize your own world with the help from the transcendental, then from this necessarily will come the idea of normativity, ethics, naitikta, ideals, the ideals of ethics and normative ideals, they came from the transcendental. And isi se, from here emerged the idea of universal ethics, that whole humanity must behave in certain ways. So behaving in one way is good and behaving in another way is bad for everyone. Of course, there were exceptions, and India was a big exception, because in India, this universal ethics did not come. The ethics in India was divided in two parts, the general ethics part and what is known as swadharma, the ethics of the person. And that the ethics of the person depended on which varna he came from, Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. So the ethics for each varna was separate, in India. That is an exception, but we are talking in general terms. We will come to Indian exceptions later. The emergence of second order, this is very important. The third point, I mean, all points are important, but just notice the importance of the third point. In axial period, through the philosophers, emergence of second order thinking develops. By second order thinking, I mean, the Homo sapiens have been thinking for as long as they have existed in some form or the other. But this second order thinking, you can say that this is something like thinking about thinking. So you can examine your own thinking. You can examine your own ideas, this, kind of reflexivity, and you can examine yourself, this kind of self-reflexivity. This gives also rise to the tradition of argumentation and critique, and philosophy arises. All this happens, mainly in the axial era, and then in axial era, also the creativity of the individual is recognized and comes to the foreground for the first time. And creativity of the individual means remarkable individuals arose, So that is the fourth point, role of the elite. Prophets came. Prophets, of course, were individuals, and they gathered, they legislated for the entire society, and they gathered, entire society behind them. Philosophers came who gave, the results of their thinking into well-defined philosophy. And ascetics came, the saints, ascetics, क्या कहेंगे, ascetic, you understand, Mahatmas, और जिन्होंने जीवन त्याग, आम जीवन त्याग कर दिया है, those ascetics came. All these were creative individuals, and these individuals played a stellar role in the life of the community. So if you contrast it with the pre-axial period, the society in the pre-axial period was largely communitarian. There may be a leader of the community, who may be leading the rituals and dancing around the fire, but largely the entire community participated, and everything was defined by the collective participation of the entire community. Here, the role of a special individual shines through in the form of the prophet, the philosopher, and the ascetic. This was a major element of the axial breakthrough. This other point we have already talked about, in Jasper's quote, that spiritualization of religion takes place and transition happens from religion as a way of life of the community to a cosmic worldview. Now religion has to give a cosmic worldview. How did the universe arise, and how did the humans arise, and what is the meaning of life, and so on. From polytheism to monotheism, and from the practice of feeding the gods to salvation of the soul. देवताओं की पूजा अर्चना करो ताकि तुम्हारे ऊपर उनकी कृपा हो. This can be described as feeding the gods. ये जो ट्राइबल और मिथिकल एरा का था, उसके बाद एक बिल्कुल नया कॉन्सेप्ट सामने आता है, आत्मा की मुक्ति, salvation of the soul. This is one of the key features of the spiritualization of religion. And most important, which I considered, thanks to Charles Taylor, who has pointed out in his dealing with Charles Taylor is a famous philosopher. He is still alive, and he is a major philosopher of 20th century, a Canadian. He, in his article, he brings out the same things in a different way. He said that the most important part he considers was the disembedding of the individual. What does this mean? In pre-axial archaic cultures, individual was embedded in the community. इंडिविजुअल जो था वो एकदम अभिन्न अंग था कम्युनिटी का. इंडिविजुअल को कम्युनिटी के मेंबर के अलावा उसका कुछ की कोई और परिभाषा नहीं थी, कोई और उसका एग्जिस्टेंस नहीं था. सो इन द प्री एक्सियल आर्केइक कल्चर्स, इंडिविजुअल वाज एम्बेडेड इन द कम्युनिटी, and this embedding happened along in three ways. First, in the community. So the individual was part of the community. Community was part of the cosmos. And from there came, in the community came the idea of flourishing, human flourishing, that, what is human good? जो मानव जाति का अंतिम लक्ष्य है वो फ्लरिश करना है, जीवित रहना और अपने आप को अच्छी तरह से, अपना जीवन अच्छी तरह से यापन करना. इसी के लिए सारा रिलीजन था, इसी के लिए सारे देवता थे, और इसी के लिए सारे रिचुअल्स थे. तो ये इनके थ्रू जो एम्बेडिंग था इंडिविजुअल का कम्युनिटी में, दैट कैन बी कंट्रास्टेड विद दीज थ्री डिसएम्बेडिंग्स. द इंडिविजुअल attains an autonomous existence. Individual becomes disembedded, separated from community. Not separated, disembedded. Community is there. Individual is part of the community, but it comes in its own. Individual is recognized, and the existence of the transcendental. This comes through. The community is not the entire universe. Because you have seen already, the philosophers and thinkers and prophets conceptualize another world which is separate from this world. And the existence of this transcendental world, that also helps, in enlarging the cosmic view, enlarging the idea of the cosmos in such a way, that community is no longer the sum total. And then comes the concept of the salvation of the individual soul. जब मुक्ति की बात होती है तो प्रत्येक अलग अलग सोल, अलग अलग आत्मा की मुक्ति की बात होती है, पूरी कम्युनिटी की मुक्ति की बात नहीं होती है. तो salvation of the individual soul. So this disembedding of the individual from the communitarian continuum, individual jumps out, of the river of the community. This disembedding of the individual, that Charles Taylor considers a major element of the axial breakthrough. Now, having just summarized or briefly given you an idea of how people conceptualize the axial era and axial breakthrough, Bhartendu Kashyap trivial. What is trivial? Padma Singh. Achha.
Nothing serious from my side.
Okay. Okay. Religion. Now let us come to the concept.
Just meaning of mundane. I have written that. Nothing.
No, no. That's not right, Parthendu. Mundane is not trivial. Mundane is not trivial. Mundane is this entire world, entire universe in which we, so it is not trivial.
And I was emphasizing self-reflexivity. I was thinking, oh, it's the most difficult for me.
So now let us come to Robert Bellah. And this is a theorist which I have recently discovered, and I have taken a lot of help from his very fat book. It's almost 800-page long book. And he has written other articles too. And just on the side note, I can say that I knew about him for quite some time, but wasn't paying attention to him because I wasn't sure, who is this theorist of religion? Why should I bother for a theorist of religion? But then I read that when he was a graduate student, or when he was doing his PhD at Harvard in 1948-49, he was a member of the American Communist Party. And not only the McCarthy era, in which communist and leftist were kind of tormented, repressed, and harassed. The Harvard University itself was harassing its student, and Harvard University was forcing. I came from Wikipedia. I came to know from Wikipedia that forcing Bellah, who was a graduate student, PhD student, and doing and also a member of the Communist Party, to reveal the names of his comrades. And he refused, and he ran away to Canada for 2 years. Later on, he came and finished his PhD and, became faculty at various places, finally moving to wherever he left. He was born in 1927 and died in 2013, So just my subjective prejudice, you can say, that I started paying attention to him because he was in his younger days a communist, which he no longer continued to be a communist later. That's a separate matter. But at least, I started reading his book, and then I was mesmerized by it. So I have paid a lot of attention to him. So he then gives a theory of religious evolution of humankind, and he, again, in his book, which is called Religion in Human Evolution, from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age, that's his magnum opus, that's his book published in 2011. He describes three stages, of religious evolution. The tribal religion, which the major elements of tribal religion as mimetic culture. Mimetic means nakal karna. नकल करने का अंग्रेजी है मिमेटिक, जिसमें से ड्रामा, थिएटर, सब कुछ पैदा होता है. So mimetic culture, which is language of the body, for example dance, for example enacting some scene, and so on. So this was the period of mimetic culture. And as we will see later, we will deal with another theorist briefly, in which we will see that the mimetic culture in the cultural evolution, cognitive evolution of humankind, mimetic culture arose even before languages arose. So this was the language of the body pre-existed the language per se, the spoken language per se. So the tribal religion started with mimetic cultures. It had rituals, feeding the gods, dancing around the fire, exorcising the ghost, bhoot utarna, getting rid of the evil demons, evil spirits. And it was communitarian and egalitarian, entire community. There was no special role except for a chieftain or something, a community head, who also was equally submerged in the community. So it was completely individual, as we saw, did not have an autonomous status. There was only community, and it was completely egalitarian. Later on came the archaic religion, which was the religion of the mythologies, when the great epics came about. So mythic culture gets added to the mimetic culture. Narratives get added to enactment. So before language and before narratives, before epics, we had only, mimetic culture and some descriptions, as gradually language was developing. But in mythic age, in the archaic religion, the avatars, the the concept of various gods and their stories, they become the defining features of religion. So the epics appear, God appears, king appears as a descendant of God, and priests appear. And this society was hierarchical. This was not egalitarian like the tribal society. This was hierarchical. There were people above and there were people below. And then religion comes in the axial age. Bella adopts the axial age terminology, the concept of axial age he adopts, and he says that what is known as entry into the theoretic culture. So these three cultures, mimetic, mythic, and theoretic, we will see where he comes from. This comes out of a more detailed scientific anthropological theory of or theory of cognitive evolution. We will come in a minute to that. So what do I mean by theoretic culture? I will come in a minute. Right now, just bear with me with the term itself. So the religion in the axial age was identified with entry into the theoretic culture. Mimetic and mythic layers were superseded, but they were not entirely replaced. Spiritualization, ideal of the transcendental, and cosmic vision, such concepts appeared, and theological argumentation and philosophies arose. We have dealt with, we are familiar with these things in the previous slides. So this is how Bella describes the religious evolution, and you will see in a minute why we are going into all these very strange places and all this theory. We will link it up hopefully with the Bhakti phenomenon. I have to keep giving you this self-justification so that you don't think that I am just showing off my reading and my scholarship, which
Sorry,
is.
बस मैं एक छोटी बात पूछ सकती हूँ?
हाँ.
ये
Yes,
जो ट्राइबल आर्काइक और जो एक्सियल में जो थेरेटिक है कल्चर, तो मतलब एक दिमाग में सवाल आ रहा है कि क्या ये कोई पैटर्न एक से बेहतर दूसरा इमर्ज करता गया, कि कोई बेहतरी जरूरी नहीं है, बस ये फेजेस हैं. हम ये नहीं कह सकते हैं ये फेज उससे बेहतर है, ये फेज उससे बेहतर है.
हाँ, नहीं, ये तो नहीं है. ये तो अभी वैल्यू जजमेंट नहीं है. यही नेक्स्ट स्लाइड्स में है कि ये जो इवोल्यूशन के स्टेजेस हैं, इसके बारे में एविडेंस क्या है, क्या प्रूफ है कि ह्यूमन सिविलाइजेशन इन स्टेजेस में इवॉल्व किया, और वैल्यू जजमेंट तो अलग से बात है. कोई कह सकता है कि हम सबसे अच्छा ट्राइबल में थे, उसके बाद गिरते गए हैं, और कोई कह सकता है कि हम सबसे बुरे ट्राइबल में थे, उसके बाद से चढ़ते गए हैं. सो दैट्स अ लेटर डिबेट, दैट्स अ लेटर, दैट डिपेंड्स ऑन व्हाट फिलॉसफी यू सब्सक्राइब टू. अभी तो ऑब्जेक्टिवली जो इवोल्यूशन के स्टेजेस हैं उनकी बात हो रही है. सो यू विल सी इन द नेक्स्ट स्लाइड कि अच्छा, तो a little bit more from Bella and then I will go to Donald, the cognitive scientist. Depth of culture and superposition of layer. Bella का famous sentence है जो चार्ल्स टेलर भी कोट करते हैं कि nothing is ever lost. कल्चर में ऐसा नहीं होता कि एक सिस्टम दूसरे सिस्टम से कंप्लीटली रिप्लेस किया जाता है. It's not that one culture is completely replaced by another culture. Tribal society still lives in us. Archaic society still lives in us, but the theoretic society has come to fore and that dominates. But that doesn't mean that the previous stages of cultural evolution, they have left us, or they have been replaced, or they have been eliminated. So inka famous sentence hai ki nothing ever gets lost. And this creates a problem for the Marxist theories of history and culture. We will come to that towards the end, that how do we understand that these things survive even if systems do not survive. So Bella, I just take a quote from Bella. This raises a crucial question about the place of the axial transformation in human history. Granted that these introduced changes were of immense importance in human history, which is why we think it is worthwhile to define just what those changes were. What are we to think of pre-axial life which they transformed? हम pre-axial, axiality के पहले वाले लाइफ के बारे में क्या सोचे? अच्छा सोचे, बुरा सोचे, जिनको की axiality ने replace किया. Is this merely superseded? क्या ये केवल उसके ऊपर आ जाता है? I mean, इस तरह से कि pre-axial relegated to unrecoverable past, the pre-axial part of life cannot be recovered anymore. क्या ऐसा होता है? और is it in various ways still present? क्या ऐसा है कि ये आज भी मौजूद है, जिसके बाद ये नए लेयर्स पैदा हुए, जैसे कि थ्योरेटिक लेयर पैदा हुआ, उसके आने के बावजूद क्या पुरानी लेयर्स अभी भी मौजूद हैं? एंड inescapably so in post axial life, क्या एक्सियल के बाद वाली लाइफ में भी ये लेयर्स मौजूद हैं? अच्छा, चार्ल्स टेलर का कोट है, सॉरी, ये कोट चार्ल्स टेलर का है. Bella's crucial insight, formulated in the phrase that nothing is ever lost, points us towards some version of the second answer. Second answer माने कि खत्म नहीं होता है, लेयर्स एक के ऊपर एक जमती जाती हैं. This is what Charles Taylor is writing in an article called what was the axial revolution. Charles Taylor का आर्टिकल है, उससे ये कोट लिया हुआ है. Now we come to what already Padma was mentioning कि we are, ये जो stages है, these stages of religious evolution that Bella uses has support from more scientific evidence. Merlin Dolan, for example, a cognitive psychologist, and he has done work on the on cognitive evolution and cognitive cultural evolution. And Bella makes use of theory of cognitive evolution of Merlin Donald as a basis for his own theory of religious evolution. Donald's psychological cognitive theory talks of co-evolution of hominid brain and culture. Hominid माने होमो सेपियंस का, हम लोगों का ब्रेन, co-evolution, साथ साथ ब्रेन और कल्चर का इवोल्यूशन एक साथ कैसे हुआ. And I take a long quote from, I think, Donald, but we will see. I think it is from Merlin Donald. Human cultures are by nature cognizing entities. Cognizing माने हम cognition, यानी हम aware होते हैं, हम समझते हैं चीजें. Human cultures are by nature cognizing entities. That is, cognitive activity, समझने बूझने की एक्टिविटी, cognitive activity is an integral part of their definition. Thus, human cultures can perceive, remember, decide, construct worldviews, and represent reality. Now, this is part of human culture from the beginning. The field of cognitive science is typically identified with the study of single individuals, as if the mind were locked in a brain box, which to a large degree it is. He is recognizing that कि cognitive science जो अभी पैदा हुआ है नया नया, वो सोचता है वो केवल single individual human brain को और human mind को समझने की कोशिश करता है. ऐसा लगता है कि mind जो है वो single brain में locked है, केवल single brain में exist करता है, which to a large extent is true, he is saying. However, human beings have a shared knowledge base anchored in culture, which is not restricted to the experience of individuals and is substantially wider and deeper than any single person's comprehension of it. जो shared knowledge है, जो culture में पॉजिटेड है, कल्चर में रहता है, वो किसी भी एक व्यक्ति के, ज्यादा से ज्यादा जानकार व्यक्ति के नॉलेज से 1000 गुना ज्यादा है. कोई भी सिंगल व्यक्ति सारा कुछ नहीं जान सकता जो किसी कल्चर के नॉलेज बेस में स्टोर्ड है. द कॉग्निटिव एक्टिविटीज ऑफ ए कल्चर आर ऑर्गेनाइज्ड, गवर्न्ड एंड डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड अक्रॉस एन एंटायर पॉपुलेशन ग्रुप. नो इंडिविजुअल माइंड can encompass the knowledge of an entire culture. Rather, a cultural knowledge base is stored in culture, that is, displayed and refined in the public domain and remembered by the group. आप क्रूड एग्जाम्पल हम दे सकते हैं कि लाइब्रेरी में जितना नॉलेज है वो सारा किसी एक दिमाग में ठूसा नहीं जा सकता, और लाइब्रेरी में नॉलेज स्टोर्ड है जो पूरे सिविलाइजेशन का नॉलेज है. Moreover, a shared knowledge base can be highly idiosyncratic, which explains the tremendous variety found in human cultures. जो ये knowledge base है, cultural knowledge base है, distributed और shared knowledge base है, ये बहुत विविध हो सकता है, बहुत विचित्र हो सकता है, और वेरियस ह्यूमन कल्चर्स में ट्रेमेंडस डाइवर्सिटी हो सकती है, एक दूसरे से भिन्न भिन्न हो सकता है. It continues, the gradual process of evolving the hominid brain, मानव जाति का दिमाग, brain, हाँ भेजा, the gradual process of co-evolving of the human brain, hominid brain and culture, so that individuals increasingly fall under the sway of their cultures, might be called emergent enculturation. This is the reverse side of evolution of representational skill at the species level. जो डार्विन का evolution है, species जिसमें से निकलती हैं, उसका ये reverse side है. Once representation become public, the public domain soon outstrips the capacity of individual. Library individual विद्वान से बड़ी हो जाती है. The public domain soon outstrips the capacities of individuals, and they become heavily dependent on the estate of group knowledge. Brain evolution ceased at one point to be the dominant partner in this interaction. As a consequence of this shift, the human brain has been adapting to the presence of cognizing cultures for a very long time. तो ब्रेन का इवोल्यूशन शरीर के अंदर होना, ये जो शुरू में रहा होगा मेन फिनोमेनन, वो रिप्लेस हो जाता है माइंड का इवोल्यूशन ज्यादातर कल्चर में इमर्स होके कल्चरल शेयर्ड बेसिस पर होने लगता है, और इंडिविजुअल ब्रेन को हमेशा एडजस्ट करना पड़ता है. जो कॉग्नाइजिंग कल्चर है, जो समझने बूझने की संस्कृति पैदा होती है, इंटेलेक्चुअल और कल्चरल संस्कृति पैदा होती है, वो उससे हर इंडिविजुअल ब्रेन को एडजस्ट करना पड़ता है. So this is Merlin Dolland in his article on one of the summarizing articles. He has, he is very well known for his theory and he has written books, but this is the one summarizing article that I have taken.
Once again, little bit distillation and underlining.
Well, he is different. ये अलग कर रहे हैं कि जो कॉग्निटिव साइंस आज जैसे जब पैदा हुआ है और जो कैसे माइंड डेवलप होता है, वो ज्यादातर इंडिविजुअल पर फोकस करता है, और वो ऐसे मान के चलता है मानो सारा माइंड जो है इंडिविजुअल ब्रेन से पैदा होता है और उसी में कन्फाइंड है. ब्रेन जो खोपड़े के अंदर है, जो बॉक्स के अंदर है, उसी में माइंड भी है. उसको ये कंट्रास्ट कर रहे हैं कि ज्यादातर माइंड जो है डेवलप हुआ है कल्चरली, लैंग्वेज के जरिए और दूसरे कल्चरल प्रैक्टिसेस और कल्चरल नॉलेज बेस के जरिए. उसको वो एक्सटर्नल कहते हैं. ये एक इंपॉर्टेंट कंपोनेंट है थ्योरेटिक कल्चर का. थ्योरेटिक कल्चर वो है जिसमें एक्सटर्नल जो नॉलेज बेस है वो इंटरनल नॉलेज बेस की तुलना में बहुत बड़ा हो जाता है. एक्सटर्नल नॉलेज बेस स्प्रेड आउट है पूरे कल्चर में. इंटरनल नॉलेज बेस सिर्फ मेरा नॉलेज बेस मेरे खोपड़े के अंदर है, और मेरे खोपड़े के अंदर जो है वो बहुत सीमित है. जो एक्सटर्नल नॉलेज बेस है वो बहुत विशाल है. तो जो इंडिविजुअल माइंड का एनकल्चरेशन भी हुआ है और इवोल्यूशन भी हुआ है, वो इन इंटरैक्शन विद द एंटायर कल्चर हुआ है. और इंडिविजुअल माइंड लेटर पीरियड में जो है स्पेशली एक्सटर्नल नॉलेज बेस से इंटरैक्ट करते हुए ही डेवलप करता है, यानी बाहर से सीख करके ही डेवलप करता है. वो सिर्फ जैसे स्पीशीज डार्विन के इवोल्यूशन में डेवलप होती थी कि रैंडम वेरिएशन से इत्तफाकिया कोई ऐसा बच्चा किसी जीव का पैदा हो गया जिसमें कूदने की बजाय थोड़ा उड़ने की भी क्षमता आ गई, तो प्रेडेटर्स से शिकार करने वालों से जो उड़ सकता था वो ज्यादा बेहतर बच सकता था. तो वो जो रैंडम वेरिएशन से जो फिजिकल चेंज आया, जो जेनेटिक चेंज आया, उसकी वजह से स्पीशीज का विकास हुआ और दौड़ने वालों में से उड़ने वाले भी पैदा हुए. ये जो डार्विन का इवोल्यूशन का सिद्धांत था, जिसमें बॉडीली इवोल्यूशन हो रहा था, जीन्स का इवोल्यूशन हो रहा था ऑफस्प्रिंग्स के जरिए और नेचुरल सिलेक्शन के जरिए, वही जीन्स बच रही थी जो ज्यादा सक्षम थी, यानी वही स्पीशीज बच रही थी जो ज्यादा सक्षम थी अपने आप को बचाने में. ये जो फिजिकल नेचुरल प्रोसेस था उसके बजाय माइंड का इवोल्यूशन दूसरे ढंग का है. माइंड का इवोल्यूशन शुरू में तो स्पीशीज लेवल पर तो वो वो होमोसेपियंस के रूप में पैदा हुआ है, लेकिन उस लेवल पर जो ट्राइबल सोसाइटी के आज से 5,000 10,000 साल पहले के जो लोग थे, वो जेनेटिक या फिजिकल बेसिस पर हम लोगों से भिन्न नहीं थे। हम लोग इवॉल्व नहीं हुए हैं, जेनेटिकली इवॉल्व नहीं हुए हैं, कोई नई स्पीशीज हम नहीं बन गए हैं। आज का मानव और आज से 10,000 साल या 50,000 साल पहले का मानव, दोनों में स्पीशीज की कोई भिन्नता नहीं है, वही मनुष्य आज भी है। लेकिन जो नई बात पैदा हुई है वो है कल्चरल माइंड, कल्चर के साथ एडजस्ट करते हुए। और कल्चरल माइंड कैसे पैदा हुआ है कि एक्सटर्नल डिपॉजिट्स ऑफ नॉलेज, सारा एक दिमाग भी नॉलेज नहीं पैदा करता है अपने अनुभव से, एक्सटर्नल डिपॉजिट्स ऑफ नॉलेज, कोट एंड कोट फिगरेटिवली हम कह देंगे कि लाइब्रेरीज, स्टोर ऑफ नॉलेज of the entire species, of the entire community, of the entire culture। उस नॉलेज से इंटरैक्ट करते हुए हर इंडिविजुअल का माइंड इवॉल्व किया है। और ये इवोल्यूशन जेनेटिक इवोल्यूशन नहीं है, ये इवोल्यूशन कल्चरल इवोल्यूशन है, ये कह रहे हैं। सो okay, then so this is Merlin Donald's, okay, so if we summarize the stages of cognitive evolution, so the Merlin Donald's theory of cognitive cultural evolution counts 3 major transitions in the cognitive cultural history of humankind. First, he calls primate cognition. Primate cognition, this is much before, this is almost like, in the beginning of Homo sapiens, when there is no language, no culture and so on. So this is basically episodic culture. Episodic culture means that this species did not have, it was more like animals, it did not have even memory. It had memory, something like memory only to the extent that if it dealt with a situation, for example, being hunted by a higher animal, so how did it run and how did it save itself? Once it saved itself, that experience did not become a memory, so that it can recall that experience in its own mind. When the next time it was being hunted, then somehow that thing will come back, and then it will do similar things to save itself. So the memory or the culture dependent on the episodes, ghatnaएं, so this is how our species started. We only had episodic culture, reactive to episode. We only knew how to react. We had no memory. And we had no voluntary representation or communication. ऐसा नहीं कि कुछ भी ना हो रहा हो तब भी हम कोई हाथ पैर चलाने लगे, कोई हंसने लगे, रोने लगे या डांस करने लगे या किसी को कुछ कम्युनिकेट करने लगे। हमारे अपने अंदर कोई एजेंसी नहीं थी। We only knew how to react to the context and situation. So this is known as primate cognition, which is based on episodic memory and which is called episodic culture. This was the first stage. Later on, you will see how many million years ago this was the situation. Then the first transition, which was from episodic to mimetic culture, and mimetic culture is non-verbal action modeling. Now इसमें agency आ जाती है. Even if nothing is happening, you can still do a dance, to attract somebody or to repel somebody, so non-verbal action modeling, which is voluntary, communication through bodily gestures, sharirik, bhasha, beginnings of internal memory storage and voluntary action. So now we can store things in our memory and recall it in our mind while we are lying in the bed. We still can remember that how the lion attacked and how I saved myself, So, and then I can also, without any reason, I can decide that now I want to dance. So this episodic culture to mimetic culture, this is the first transition in human cognitive cultural evolution. Second transition is from mimetic to mythic culture. When language arrives, narration or storytelling arrives, oral linguistic communication, that we gain the capacity for that, an enhancement of internal memory storage, including linguistic memory. Now we can store much more in our memory because now we are linguistically equipped. So we can store stories in our memory, which oral stories, at least, or in the third transition, we will come to written stories too. So the third transition is from the mimetic and mythic to theoretic culture. Theoretic culture deals with formalisms, abstract, ideas and designs, abstractions, other theoretical artifacts. This capacity develops because this is facilitated by external symbolic storage. External symbolic storage, for example, written language, manuscripts and books, externally stored memories, institutions and cultures. Schools and universities arise, and teaching styles arise, education arise, systems of education arise. All these things happen. So facilitated by these things, theoretic culture arrives. Okay, so quickly, you don't have to worry about, I am loading you with too much of information, but quickly I want to give you a flavor. This is the table I have taken from Merlin Donald's, paper or article, So you see, those, I hope you can see the letters are small, but, in the episodic stage, which was the primate, when we were primates, higher primate, but still primate, the novel form of representation in this episodic culture that came was complex episodic event perceptions. Somehow we came to know कि ये जो episode हुआ उसमें क्या हुआ था, even though we can't remember it, but again similar episode, if it arises, we are able to immediately react in such a way as if something is stored in us, and we can save ourselves from the lion, based on the prior episodes. So this complex episodic representation, or event perception, this was the phase in the episodic stage. Mimetic stage, the second line, is early hominids, Homo erectus, and as it was called 4 million years ago. 4 million years ago to 4 lakh years ago. 40 लाख साल पहले से लेके 4 लाख साल पहले तक ये जो फेज था, ये होमो इरेक्टस का फेज था, अर्ली होमिनिड्स जिनको कहा जाता है, और this was based on non-verbal action modeling. And I can't tell you how does Merlin Donald know these things. This is a evolving science, and there is a lot of various kinds of evidence has been collected by various means. So I cannot go. I am not well qualified also, and to whatever little I know, that also I cannot describe to you the scientific development in what stages all this has taken place. But he claims that this is fairly certain. Of what he is saying here. In the mythic culture, in the second transition, sapient humans, us, we come peaking in the sapiens, what is known as Homo sapiens sapiens. We are Homo sapiens sapiens. This starts from 5 lakh saal pehle, half a million years ago till present. And in this, linguistic modeling comes into play. Whatever, we can describe things in language, and so on. And then the theoretic transition, this is the recent sapient culture. So, this transition is not dependent on some genetic transition or some species transition. This has happened, within the Homo sapiens sapiens. We haven't changed in last, half a million years. We are the same. For half a million years, humans are the same genetically and physically. But culturally, they have changed. And this cultural evolution phase is the mainly because theoretic cultures has arisen. And then I also wanted to take another table from him to compare. This is for, this may be important, compare the latest with the second latest, mythic with theoretic. In mythic, narrative is predominant. In theoretic, analytic and paradigmatic, paradigms, that is dominant. In mythic, authority-based, prophet or whoever is the authority, God, whoever is the authority. In theoretic, it is evidence-based, you will see this contrast, important when it becomes important when we come to modernity, and we will realize that modernity is continuation of axiality. In mythic, thinking is slow and deep. In theoretic, the thinking is fast and shallow. Slow and deep means, all in the mythologies, the entire life presents itself. There is no, fragmentation of knowledge. The knowledge is one and whole, entire thing, Whereas in theoretic, there are divisions and there are techniques of thinking fast, and there are techniques of thinking instrumentally. We think only to solve the problem at hand. And that instrumentality of thinking, that gives rise to, in a way, gives rise to shallow thinking. Fast thinking, but shallow thinking. It does not go into the philosophical. When you use your technology, when you use your cell phones, you don't go to Einstein's GPS system and Einstein's general theory, and then through Einstein's general theory of relativity to entire scientific revolution and all that. You just use your cell phone, and you know that it works. In mythic, the focus is inner. People looked at themselves more, inside themselves, based on feelings and spiritual, experiences. In theoretic, we want to understand the outer world, and so on. I don't have to go through the whole list. So you get an idea. You get an idea that what these cognitive scientists and theorists of cultural revolution, how do they differentiate things, and how those developments in our mind, which we now take for granted, we did not have those capacities a few thousand years ago, or 10 or 20,000 years ago. And these transitions, these cultural cognitive transitions, there are evidence, in literature and otherwise, evidence has been found that such transitions did take place. Now we come to from axial age to modernity. So as I said, modernity falls inside the era inaugurated by the axial age. The consequences of the axial breakthrough, namely arrival of the theoretic stage, the consequences of the axial breakthrough are still unfolding. Ye jari hai abhi. The advent of modernity is a sub-stage in the march of axiality. I have coined this term axiality, and so to just not refer to the whole thing all the time. So modernity is a part of axiality. The cognitive cultural core of modernity is formed by the scientific revolution. The new thing that has happened as compared to 2,500 years ago, when axial transition took place, the new thing that has happened is scientific revolution and the intellectual cultural revolution of the modern times, last 300 years or so. This is the core of modernity, as transcendental and reorganizing the mundane according to transcendental, appearance of theoretic culture and appearance of charismatic creative individuals. All that was part of axiality. Same way, scientific revolution, the modern philosophers, modern, cultural, intellectual breakthroughs. This is the part of modernity. And this point I especially underline because this is how we, for our purpose, define modernity. We don't define modernity as everything put together. We don't define modernity as whatever exists in modern times, including the state, politics, everything that happens to be in modern times, capitalism and so on. Capitalism we treat separate from modernity. So we are identifying the core of modernity in parallel with the core of axiality. The way the core of axiality was theoretic culture, same way core of modernity is scientific and analytical theoretic, further development of theoretic culture. The relationship of modernity with axiality has many aspects. Some historians and scholars have noted that the 5 great revolutions of modern times, they all happened in axial civilizations. This is a far-fetched hypothesis, but I just wanted to mention it to you that people have argued that notice that the 5 modern great revolution, English Revolution, England में 17th century, American Revolution 1776, 18th century, French Revolution 1789, 18th century, Russian Revolution 20th century, Chinese Revolution 20th century, and many others. But these 5 great revolutions, they all happened in axial civilization. India is an exception. I will come to that Indian exception in the next slide. So Eisenstadt, one of the theorists of axial civilizations, he makes this point that the second major premise, or more correctly hypothesis, of this part of the book he wrote, the book he is referring to, he wrote a book called The Great Revolutions and the Civilizations of Modernity, which came out in 2006. The second major premise, or more correctly hypothesis, of this part of the book is that the major civilizational frameworks within which revolutions tend to develop are certain types of axial age civilizations. That is, above all, those axial civilizations in which the political arena constitutes an important forum of the implementation of the transcendental vision predominant in them, and especially imperial or imperial feudal systems and situations of transitions to modernity. So he is saying the relationship between axial age civilization and modern revolutions happened only in those axial civilizations where political arena was very active, where axial breakthrough or axial strategy was implemented mainly in the political arena. And in this, and China was being the prime example, and also West being the prime example. In this, India was different. In India, as we will see, many scholars have noted that India is a peculiar society where politics has been somewhat separate from social life. So that because of that exception, India, these people will argue that India, while it is an axial civilization, it did not go through a great revolution because of the separation, relative separation between the political arena and the social cultural arena. So Indian civilization as an exceptional case. India failed to have a great revolution. The transition from axiality to modernity has been absent in large parts of its history. The contemporary transition to modernity has been faltering and patchy. Its logic is mostly externally driven. By externally driven, I mean by modernity comes via colonialism, not through the internal logic of the society itself. One key factor behind Indian exceptionality and axial civilization, by exceptionality I mean an axial civilization not having a great revolution and lacking an internally driven transition to modernity. One key factor behind Indian exceptionality is the relative separation and disjunction between the social life and the political arena. Those of you interested in, I don't have time to go into the detail, but you can read this chapter. There is a chapter in that book by Eisenstadt. It's called, the chapter 6 is Otherworldly Civilization, the Hindu civilization. He makes some comments about that. This is where the long-term millennial scale consequences of Bhakti movement becomes factors of key importance in the civilizational history of India. So why I have dwelt so much with आपको लग सकता है कि इतना theoretical knowledge झाड़ने की क्या जरूरत है? Why have I taken you to all this theoretical detour? Because this presents the framework in which I can make sense of what is the millennial impact of Bhakti movement. So I see Bhakti as a great impediment in the march of axiality and in the transition to modernity. एक भारी रुकावट है Bhakti आंदोलन. Bhakti has not led to greater spiritualization of religious life and practices. Point number 1. Because you remember, one of the key features of axial breakthrough was to make religion spiritual. And I don't want to repeat, you remember all the things that I have already said. Bhakti movement did, despite its appearance, that some of, especially the Nirgun saints, used to talk about abstract God and talk about spirituality, the impact that it has left on the society, it has not, in the end, it has not made the society more spiritual. So even in the arena of religion, that development, further progression to theoretic culture, and to spiritualization, that has not happened due to bhakti in the religious arena itself. It did not affect any significant reordering of the mundane social and political life in accordance with an idea of the transcendental, religious and spiritual belief. Elements of it you can find, and you can quote, Guru Nanak or Kabir and so on, that, they are referring to some spirituality and telling people how to become, good people, but, I am talking of the overall impact, the way Indian social mind was weaved, created by the Bhakti movement. That Indian mind is not necessarily more spiritual and more ethical. It did not give rise to great philosophies and theological argumentation. That is obvious. The whole thing, the whole Bhakti Marg, it depends on bhakti, devotion, and not on philosophical argumentation. No intellectual rational development. No great philosophers, prophets, or no great creative minds emerge from this system. You might be, offended by my saying so. You will say that, oh, are you telling that Kabir was not creative? Or Sur or Tulsi were not creative? They were creative, but I am talking of creativity at a different level, creativity at an epochal level, when new philosophies, new cosmic worldviews are created, new philosophical, worldviews, are proposed, and older worldviews are replaced by newer worldviews. Bhakti Andolan has not contributed, any significantly to such a development. Also, even more importantly, Bhakti did not close or reduce the gap between social and the political arena. Bhakti remained mostly in the social arena, and the scholars have speculated that Bhakti movement in some parts of the country, especially in North India, may be a reaction to the Islamic rule, implicitly. But more or less, whether that's true or not, even if that is true, is still the Bhakti stream, the Bhakti era, the Bhakti phenomenon operated in the social sphere, and it further delinked itself from the political arena. So the separation between social and political arena that China is utilizing to its great advantage, and which we are still stuck with that gap. And if that gap is now being filled with modern electoral democracy, then it is giving rise to not good results, but bad results. We will come to that in the next slide. So this gap has not been filled. This gap is now being filled by modern politics, but many problems arise because what the social life, what kind of impact social life on social life Bhakti movement has had. And lastly, it did not encourage the disembedding of the individual from the community. Bhakti movement does not propose, even though there are people who have equated the Bhakti movement with the Protestant, movement in Christianity, where individual was empowered. But, some argument can be made in that direction. But by and large, the disembedding of the individual from the community and individual becoming autonomous, responsible, self, which can go against the community, or whose life is beyond and separate from the life of the community. At least it has parts of life and that is separate from the community. That kind of disembedding of individual from the community, Bhakti movement has not helped in that. Now, one digression. I know that, I was too much, I have, bitten too much. I can't chew all of this, but I wanted to drop this in your ear, even if, I am not doing justice to all the difficult topics and subjects that I have undertaken. Just a mild digression that, this kind of view of cultural evolution, and role of culture in society, this presents some challenges to the standard Marxist theory. even though actually Marxist theory is not really challenged, I believe. So what are the challenges of the theory of history and culture? What challenges culture brings? This kind of theory of cultural evolution brings to Marxist theory of history. Marxist theory of history, I don't have time to go into, but you are familiar with it, most of you, that, it explains history as changes in the mode of production. It says that history is history of class struggles. So basically, history is changes in the mode of production driven by the conflict between forces of production and relations of production. When forces of production keep on developing and the boundary is presented by the existing relations of production, and when relations of production becomes barrier to further development of forces of production, that is the time when era of revolutions arise. That is what Marx famously said. This is basically Marxist theory of history. And this leads to one system. System is the key word. One system like feudalism, system like capitalism. One system is replaced by another system. Now, what is the Marxist theory of culture? There is a key difference. Marxist theory of culture, we have seen that in culture, what happens? In culture, previous culture does not need to be entirely replaced by entirely new culture. A system is completely replaced by a new system. Feudalism is replaced by capitalism. And feudal mindset may prevail, but as a system, nothing of feudalism remains. So it is more or less completely replaced, over a period of time, over a century or more, but feudalism is completely replaced by capitalism. That does not happen in the realm of culture. No culture is entirely replaced. In cultural evolution, as Bella said, nothing gets lost. Cultural mind retains memories of the past, and this is the key thing. Systems do not retain memory, but individuals and communities and cultures retain memory. And that is the big difference. That is why past cultures are never completely eliminated. They go into the depths of the present. That is why cultural present is very deep. Systemic present is not that deep, but cultural present is very deep. It contains past in it. So cultural mind retains memories of the past. Cognitive cultural breakthroughs, including cultural changes triggered by new systems. Of course, new systems give rise to certain new cultural, phenomena or trends. I am not denying that culture has a material basis. Culture has its basis in new systems, but new systems, they give rise to new elements in culture, but new culture that are generated by the material basis, they do not need to eliminate all the previous culture. They just get deposited on the previous layers. So the cognitive cultural breakthroughs, including the cultural changes triggered by new systems, create new cultural layers, and the older cultural layers become increasingly subterranean. Subterranean means they go down in the cultural memory or in the cultural being. So this does not, I believe that we can discuss this much more later, maybe in August meeting. This does not negate the Marxist theory of history. Marxist theory of history doesn't need to be replaced because we understand cultural evolution in this way. So revolution is not negated by evolution. In culture, evolution happens. In system, revolutions happen. So this does not negate the Marxist theory of history. A complete replacement of a given system does not require a complete replacement of the pre-existing culture. The troubled path, of Indian modernity, then if we summarize all of this together, and I am summarizing it brutally, this is a subject on which one can spend a lifetime trying to understand it. The transition to modernity has been driven largely by external logic. What do I mean by external logic? Modernity was introduced by colonialism, and it was nursed by an anti-colonial struggle, which has led to the modern republic, modern political arena. This is how modernity has been introduced, into Indian culture. Democracy in a largely pre-modern society And in a civilization where counter-axial trends have been strong, this is where democracy has come into play. And this has created all the problems that we often talk about. How a modern republic can be established and entrenched in a society that is largely pre-modern. That creates its problem. Democracy threatening to become, in fact, the so related point is that, in fact, democracy threatens to become a vehicle of imposing pre-modern social and civilizational constraint on the modern political arena. The pre-modern social fault lines that exist in our culture, for example, separate religious identities, they become operational through democracy, through competitive electoral democracy. We often talk about this point in NSI. The challenge is to safeguard the political modernity and to find ways to advance modernity in the social cultural arena. Too small, in one line, one is trying to put the entire future program that one political modernity is the first one to arrive. Modernity has arrived in our civilization largely through modern republic and modern state. And this political modernity is to be safeguarded from itself, in the sense that this political modernity has to be safeguarded from democracy itself, or from the bad effects of democracy. Those bad effects of a democracy, in the sense that electoral competition triggers, the backward, social fault lines to become politically operative. For example, in the case of Hindutva. So the challenge is to safeguard the political modernity. From this comes entire strategy and tactics of what kind of politics the left should do in today's times. And then future plan is to find ways to inject modernity in the social cultural arena itself, recognizing that modernity will be injected into the social cultural arena largely through political modernity, largely through state, largely through modernizing of the political arena. But that creates problem, because social and cultural, if it remains pre-modern and a political arena becomes modern, then in certain situations, mainly because of competitive electoral democracy, the social cultural arena at times begins to dominate. So we will have to do something separate, while working in the political arena and while safeguarding modernity. The left has to come up with a plan to intervene separately in the social cultural arena too, so that parallel processes are triggered in the society, so that modernity can be brought in. The core of modernity, namely rationality, namely philosophy, namely modern culture, namely gains of scientific revolution, namely the modern cosmological view, namely the culture based on modern cosmological view, science and philosophy, and modern understanding of art and literature. All these things get established in the society. So I think that is where I will end. And I'm sorry, again, I have taken much longer today, but I am not so unhappy about taking longer today. Today, I wanted to conclude the entire series, about Bhakti and situating it in the millennial context, So I think I will stop here. Hopefully, we will have lively discussion.